Good afternoon. My name is Jessica Gluck. I'm a senior here at Bowdoin and the president of Bowdoin Financial Literacy. It's a pleasure to welcome all of you to today's Common Hour. We are very fortunate to have Anand Marri, Bowdoin class of 1995, with us to give today's talk. Anand is vice president and head of outreach and education for the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, serving as the highest ranking officer for education for the Federal Reserve System nationwide. He's also a tenured professor at Teachers College at Columbia University. He's widely recognized as an authority on education for young people on the subject of economic literacy. Anand has published numerous peer-reviewed journal articles and several chapters, has contributed articles to CNN and the New York Times, and serves on the editorial board of several leading journals. He has received over $5.5 million in grants from organizations such as the Carnegie Corporation of New York, Joyce Cowin Foundation, NYS Education Department, Peterson Foundation, Spencer Foundation, the U.S. Department of Education, and Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. Anand graduated from Bowdoin with a major in government and legal studies and a minor in Asian studies, and earned his master's at Stanford University and his PhD at the University of Wisconsin Madison. We look forward to hearing his talk today titled The Importance of Financial Literacy. Following the talk, there will be an informal Q&A and career chat upstairs in the Bean classroom. Please join me in welcoming Anand Marri.
Thank you very much. All right. Okay, so this is on. So thank you very much for taking the time for you guys to come on a beautiful Friday afternoon here in Maine. And one thing I've noticed is that I took my Gov 214 class about 20 years ago, right in this auditorium, third row, and some things never change because the kids are always sitting in the back. There's no one up there, so some things never change. But anyway, so thank you very much. So I'm just changing the top a little bit to talk about economic literacy, as well as I'm going to give you a little brief intro to the Fed, what the system is and so forth. And before I start, I do have to say the views I represent are solely my own and do not represent the Federal Reserve Bank of New York or the Federal Reserve System. So that's out of the way. So to begin with, so let's start. So when I, fall of '91, my first semester here, and little did I expect to be here in 2017. My first semester grades at Bowdoin were 3 C's and a D. I didn't expect to be able to do this, and so I'm very happy. And thank you to Nate, Casey, Tim, everybody, and Professor Santoro, and so forth for inviting me back to talk to you about this. So what I want to do today is talk to you about several things. One, I want to talk about what is economic literacy, explain what that means and what it means for you as active, engaged democratic citizens. Second, and then talk about why that's important, and then talk about Personal Finance 101. All of this will be public. You could request a deck from Nate anytime, all the sites and everything, and we'll put it up on the Federal Reserve website as well, so you can download that for free and everything like that, as well as the introduction to the Federal Reserve System. So let's start with this. First thing is that, don't read that yet, but one of the things that we do, the work in education in general, is that, and the point of liberal arts education and so forth, is not to become junior economists, right? We don't want you to be an econ major that's going to be an economist or a government major like myself. Rather, the point of the education that you're experiencing and that we try to promote across the country is to create active and engaged democratic citizens. And that means that you understand the economic forces that affect your lives, right? So if you are conversant in the language of economics, you can read through public policy, political philosophy, you can come up with anything, and you can decipher that and figure out when people are saying this out in public, whether that makes sense to you or not, and why it makes sense to you or not. And that way that you can engage in democratic discussions with your fellow citizens as we live in an active democratic republic in this country. So that's the larger goal of this. We don't want you to become junior economists. We don't want you to be financial literacy experts, but rather to use the language and be familiar with the language, because language is power. And if you don't understand what other people are talking about, you're already one step behind. And we want to put everyone on the same platform and the same level field, because there's inequality in this country to begin with. Some people are born on third base. Some people are, still on the batting deck, right? Waiting to go up there. And we want to try to make this more equitable society. And one way that I believe that we do that is to promote economic literacy. And you see the definition for economic literacy out there, and think about economic problems. And also, the larger point is that it allows you to understand the macro and the micro forces that affect your lives. And every one of us is affected by economics and public policy. And if you're living in this country, whether you're documented, undocumented, wherever you live. And we live in a global society where the borders are no longer as rigid as they used to be. So that's the larger point of this, that we do work here. And this is something that we believe very strongly in the work that I do in my academic career, as well as the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, is we want to promote active and engaged democratic citizens. Because if you can engage in public policy, you can help public policy makers make better decisions that affect all Americans and people all across the world to do that. So that's what I mean by larger economic literacy. And why economic literacy is, when you think about economic literacy, we know that, there's two things that are standing out in the way, which is that Americans are really not really good at managing their wealth, right? There are people that are born in this country that have advantages over other people, and they have opportunities to become more wealthy. But in general, most people don't know how to maximize their wealth. And so that's one thing. And before I get into this, and when I talk about economic literacy, I just want to go back one thing. Sorry, back there. So the economic literacy is that it's three parts. It is the idea that you understand the macro forces that affect your lives. And that means that you understand fiscal policy. And then you understand monetary policy. And that how that affects your micro level, which is the personal finance. So when I talk about fiscal policy, most people's eyes glaze over, which is fine. My kids' eyes glaze over, my wife's eyes glaze over, because they're like, oh, what's fiscal policy? When you talk about fiscal policy, we're talking about taxes and spending and so forth, right? How much should the government spend on on defense? How much should be allocated for Social Security? How much should be allocated for tax cuts, and so forth? That's the fiscal policy. And the next part is monetary policy, which I'll talk to you about a little later. It's about interest rates. It's about monetary policy, financial stability. And the third part is personal finance. And I argue that all three are related, because your fiscal policy of this country determines what your disposable income is, how much money you have to spend on the choices that you want to be able to make, right? So if you have a high marginal tax rate, that means you have less money in your pocket. But at the same time, those taxes are paying for services that we all depend on, right? Even in states that don't have an income tax, like the states of Texas and Florida, they have property taxes that pay for public schools and for trash collection and so forth. Little things that we all depend on, like transportation and so forth. So that's where the fiscal policy comes in. And monetary policy directly affects your personal finance, because it depends how much you're getting from a bank on your interest, right? If you are getting 10 basis points is 0.1% or so forth, that determines, because the Fed determines those interest rates and how much it takes for your money to double and so forth. And then the third part is the personal finance, is when you get this money, what happens to it? How do you spend that money is what's important. So they're all related, and that's why when I see people talk about financial literacy, I'm saying that's only 1/3 of the whole ballgame. You need to understand the larger picture of fiscal, monetary, and personal finance. And if you understand fiscal policy, monetary policy, and personal finance, you know more than 99% of all Americans out there. So that's something I think that should be an aspirational goal, to be able to understand, to be part of that 1%, in a way that you're an economically literate citizen that understands how to be an active and engaged democratic citizen. And as a student at Bowdoin, and where you're aiming for the common good, I think that's a really good goal to have to begin with. So let me go back. So we talked about monetary policy. We talked about economic literacy, what I mean by economic literacy, not monetary policy yet. And then we're talking about why economic literacy at the micro level. So going back to what I said about limiting people's wealth, right? It's one of the secrets is it's not how much you make, it's how much you keep, right? That's one of the things that matters. You could be making, I don't know, $1 million a year in just your gross income, but you're keeping zero, that doesn't really matter difference. So, and what's interesting is that Americans are good at working hard, but they're not very good at investing in savings. So this is done by my colleagues at the St. Louis Fed, and you'll see on this chart, I'm going to make it a little, you get the picture right here, I think you can see. So if you look at, this is the personal savings rates across the country. And you'll see, as Americans, that you started back in '59, you know, when my parents were born, all the way down, you'll see all the way down, it goes up and down, and you see periods, right? Periods of recession and so forth in the 70s, and then you have the early 80s as well, in the 90s, and then you see early 2000s. And then here is something you might be all very familiar with. This has to do with the last Great Recession, right? I don't know if you can see that from January of 2008 to basically when the Great Recession ended in early 2010, 2009, depending on how you want to classify it. You see that, sorry. How is it not going this way? There we go. I don't know why it's not going all the way to the end here. My apologies, it was working earlier. My fault for this. But you'll see that the savings rate from January of 2009 was at 6.6%. And after the crisis, people started savings more. Then so in 2012, it's at 7.8. In 2012, it's 8.8 and so forth. And then all of a sudden, it stops and it starts going down, right? Because people get comfortable thinking, hey, we manage this, I'm going to consume more. When times are good, the economy is thriving, people tend to say, oh, it'll be fine. I can spend more money. The consumption goes up. And the personal savings rate went down as well. So, and that's only 8% personal savings rate. So this is not something to be, if you look at across the country, some nations have savings rates over 20%. This is less than half of that. So that's one thing to keep in mind. We're not very good at savings, and we're not good at investing. So how do you get to be good at savings and investing? And so this is one of the, these are only my views, and this is based on the research I've done as well as the literature that's out there. A couple of things that these are the personal finance 101 personal finance 101 tips that I wish I knew when I was a senior at Bowdoin or a freshman at Bowdoin, trying to figure this out. So I was a financial aid kid. I did work study all my 4 years. I drove the shuttle. I worked in the library, and I was one of the most popular kids on campus because I figured out how to get rid of fines for your reserve. You had a reserve for 2 hours back in my day, and if you went over it every 15 minutes, you got charged 10 cents to reserve, and I figured out how to do that. But I figured out how to mess with the system and do that. But I wish I knew how to do this when I was a freshman at Bowdoin, first year at Bowdoin, and all the way through. The first simple thing that you learn is that you spend less than you earn. That's the first thing. I mean, I'm sure people are talking about that. And one way to do that is to lower your expenses, right? One of the things you learn is difference between needs and wants, right? You need water, which is great. And in New York City residents have the best tap water in the country. People love it. But do you really need that bottle of Poland, no offense to Maine producers, but Poland Spring or one of those other bottles? You don't need to spend, there's a difference. There's the rent you're paying, the economic rent you're paying for the upgrade, right? You're going from there. Or you can get a cup of coffee for $1, or do you need that Starbucks cup of coffee, no offense to Starbucks, for $4, right? So think about, even within the buckets of needs versus wants, you can think about the difference between the margin, the premium that you're paying for something else also. And each person's needs and wants, many people argue, are different. I argue they're not. Things like needs like shelter, food, a safe home, and so forth, education, or those are all needs that we all abide by. And do you need to have a vacation to go skiing in Aspen or wherever, or do you need to go to Cancun for spring break? That to me is a want more than a need to do that. So those are some of the things you can decide what the difference between needs and wants are and how to spend less than you earn. The second is creating and sticking to a budget. How many of you have a budget? Wow, about a third of you, right? Budgets are really easy to create, right? It's just you can use any spreadsheet to do that, and you talk about your expenses, you track those out. And the first thing with budgets is you always pay yourself first. And what do you mean by that? You either pay yourself for something that you want to possess. So if you want to help buy a house, or you want to go save for retirement, kids' college, and so forth. I know that you don't have that, but it will come around quickly. Retirement comes around quickly as well. So those are the things that so pay yourself first. And how do you do that? And you do it in a very automatic way. There are so many apps out there that allow you to withdraw cash from your savings account, your checking account, in a way that you can allocate it any other way you want to do it. And it's all automatic. So every week, every month, every 2 weeks, every 6 months, you can take money out. We live in an age of technology that makes our life so much easier, and there's so many tools that you can do that. So, and you can set these up, and you set it up, and you let it go, and you don't have to worry about it. So that's one way to do it. The fourth tip that I'm going to talk to you about is diversifying, okay? Which is that, and it's tied to the fifth one, which is that you will not beat the market in the long run, okay? Everybody tries, if you're investing in the stock market, try to beat the stock market. And you're like, well, so-and-so gives me 20% return on my money, and I'm going to keep doing that. You're not going to beat the market in the long run. People spend their whole career trying to beat the stock market. And everyone has friends that invested in Amazon, or they invested in Apple, or they invested in Berkshire Hathaway, or IBM, and so forth. There's always stories about people have beat the market, and they're billionaires, trillionaires, whatever it might be. That's not going to be you, right? That is not going to be. No offense, I'm not trying to squash anybody's ambitions, but most of us, 99.9% of us, will be, if you can match the market in your investments, you should be very happy about that. And when you're trying to lower your expenses to do that. And we'll talk about how to do that within that. But, so any questions so far? I'm a former teacher, I can wait. All right, so that's about the halfway point, so I wanted to see if there are any questions about that. The next one is, most of you will be graduating, all of you will be graduating, let me say that. All of you will be graduating, and then what happens is that your employer, I would say 99% of employers, will give you free money. And they give you free money in terms of a match for your when you get an employment and for retirement, right? They will give you, my employer at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York was generous. They give us 7% of your gross salary as a match. They'll give that to you. If you put 7% in, they'll give you 7% to match it and for your retirement, and that adds up. My former employer at Columbia, they had a 13% match to do that. I know Bowdoin gives you a 10%, right? So those are the ones. And these are nonprofits. I know some profit companies, they give you even bigger matches to do that. But it's free money. Take it. I know when you graduate, you're trying to pay for rent, you're trying to pay for dinner, you're trying to do all these other expenses, utilities, maybe a car, and so forth. But don't turn down that free money that's there. So you're going to have to, somehow sacrifice to be able to lower your expenses elsewhere to try to make that 6%, 7%, that's free money. And if you break that over your working career, most of us are going to live for a long time. We're going to live in our 80s and 90s, right? If that's happening, that's a long working career. You could be working 50 years, and then the growth of the magic of compound interest, you can't beat it. So just take that free money and sacrifice so forth. So maybe you don't go out to drinks, or maybe you take a second job, or work on the weekends, or you volunteer, or whatever it is. But don't take that free money that you have there. The seventh thing that I want to talk to you about the personal finance is get to know William Roth. Anybody know who William Roth is? No? So Senator Roth has done more for this country than most people will ever know about. So he was the senator from the state of Delaware, and he used to work with former Vice President Joe Biden. And so what Roth set up is this three ideas of the Roth IRA, the Roth 401k, and the Roth 403b. And you now, if you have some income, can contribute to the Roth IRA right now as you can. And what it does is it's post-tax money. So it's after all the taxes are taken, you get this money and you can invest in an individual retirement account. And the beauty of that whole thing is that it grows tax-free for the rest of your life. And and you could give it to your children, you can give it to your grandkids, you can give it to use it to buy your first home, and so forth, and it's tax-free forever because you're already paying taxes on it. And it will keep going and going and going. It is one of the greatest things ever invented, and it only I started my first Roth IRA here at Bowdoin back in 1995, working with my library funds, and it was like $500. And it's grown exponentially because of that idea. So Roth IRA is a great thing. Same thing with the Roth 401k and a 403b. These are vehicles that you can use when you get your job. And it doesn't matter if you're working in a nonprofit sector and you're working or a teacher, or you're working in AmeriCorps, or you're working in investment banking, you're in grad school, whatever it is, as long as you have an income. And most people can do Roth IRAs up until they make up to like $180,000. And for Roth 401k and 403, you can contribute to that all the way through. So those are things that you should investigate and learn about. So if anything, see the word Roth, associate Roth with good, right? So that's what I would recommend to do that. The next thing is lowering your risk. You know, when you're young and you're starting out and you think you're invincible, you think you are invincible, but you're not, right? So some of us could be stepping off a curve on a city street and you can hurt your ankle or break your leg and you're out for 6 months, right? Or you get, God forbid, you get more serious accident or something like that. So you have to have insurance for yourself, your family, whoever you're taking care of, and so forth. And there are very cheap ways to insure yourself through your employer or on your own self-policy, and you guys have the advantage of youth. Insurers love you because, according to their actuarial tables, you are low risk. So if you're low risk, they will give you the lowest rates possible for you as college students and so forth. So that's one way to think about it, is I would do, if you can, to lower your risk as much as possible to do that. And the last two things about personal finance I wanted to talk to you about is that the early bird does get the worm, right? You're definitely going to, if you start saving early, you're going to be in much better shape than saving later. But at the same time, all of us could learn to be financially literate. If I can help my 70-year-old father figure out how to set up an IRA account, and it's a lot of work to help your father do that, but you can do it, right? It's one of those things that anybody can do it, and it's never too late to save. It is never, because it's one of those things that it's like muscle memory. When you start doing it, it will keep showing up and showing up. And those of you that are athletes, you remember that, right? So you do go to practice over and over and over. I hated going to football practice. I hated going to rugby practice here, 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock. I just want to watch TV, veg out, but you got to go there. And we hated practice. For that reason, you're like, what's the point of this? But then when it came to Saturdays, you were fine, because it's that muscle memory that shows up all the time to do that. So that's my 9th tip. And then the 10th tip is, part of the reason is I'm here to help. I'm a resource. There's other resources that are available for you that are free and that are trusted. And so the first one is the National Credit Union Administration. Anybody heard of NCUA before? Oh, that's good. So several of you have. And so it's a nonprofit, and it has financial literacy resources in there for you. And I'll pull it down. So it's got all these websites that you can go to, and it's like a clearinghouse where you can teach you how to do a budget, where it could teach you, if you go to mymoney.gov, you can go to consumerfinance.gov, kids, all these things, they're all there, financial tools and resources they are there for you to check out. They'll help you create budgets. It's just a spreadsheet you can download. You can do it on a mobile app. You can do it as you're waiting in line at the dining hall, wherever it is that are there. So go to, I'm a big believer in using sources that are .gov or .org, because they tend to be the nonprofits and they're trying not to sell you anything, right? There's a lot of different, for a research project that I saw, that I led at Columbia, we looked at all the financial literacy curriculums that are out there, and this was in 3 years ago. There are over 900 different types of financial literacy curricula out there. So it's a little overwhelming, but what we've done is we figured out if you tend to go to the government sources or the nonprofit sector, they will give you the best information out there, and then they're not selling you anything. So that's something to keep in mind. So that website's there for you. The next one is this, sorry, go back. The second book is this Andrew Tobias, The Only Investment Guide You'll Ever Need. I bought this is the 3rd edition now. I bought this guide back, and it's less than $9 on Amazon, or you can probably get it at the library. Is that it is the simplest way to try to figure out investment and savings and so forth. And the title says it all. Since it's 3rd edition, I bought this back in 96 or 97. It's the only thing I use. And I don't get any money from this. It's not a pitch, but it's something that I highly recommend. The next one is Helene Olin and Harold Pollack. Harold Pollack is a professor at the University of Chicago, and they have this called index card, and it just gives you 10 rules about financial literacy that are all in one index card. It tells you about savings, investments, and so forth. And it's another book that's less than $10 on Amazon or the public library, wherever it is you want to get it. It's something that I highly recommend. It simplifies everything for you, and at the same time, no one's trying to make you a pitch. And then the last two are one of my colleagues, Beth Kolbiner. She has 2 books out, and it's called Get a Financial Life for people that are in their 20s and 30s. That came out in 2009. And the other one she has is Make Your Kid a Money Genius. And it's for parents, but what I found it is very useful for kids in high school, anywhere from elementary school all the way to their 30s. And they're very straightforward, easy to follow tips that you can do on a subway ride, on a bus ride or anything like that, and they will not take you anything. And they're both, on these, I try to pick sources that I think are high quality and they won't set you back more than $15 maximum to do that. So you can get these from any public library to do that. So those are all the tips that I have in terms of personal finance. Before I get into any of the Federal Reserve stuff, I wanted to ask if you have any questions that I can answer for you before I start thinking about more of the monetary policy stuff. So moving away from the micro to some of the micro stuff. People are really ashamed to talk about money. It's hilarious because people talk about sports, and watch the Yankees game tonight, by the way. And they talk about religion, they talk about politics, they get into it. But once you start talking about money, people are ashamed to talk about it. And that's unfortunate because we are at a college that has a lot of resources here. And there's people that are, up to 50% of Bowdoin kids are receiving financial aid. I'm going to get to your question. And there's mics for you. And so we can pass it around the mics to you so that way you don't have to come up or we can pass it around. Is that people are afraid to talk about. You should not be able to talk about money and ask questions because you don't know who else is going to be helped, who else has the same question. And if you're talking about generational wealth in this country, kids that come from low and moderate income families or kids that are African American families or Hispanic families tend to have lower generational wealth that is at least 1/3 of kids that come from well-to-do homes or white homes in this country. So we need to be able to address those, and we need to be able to talk about what this is. And so we should, it's for the greater public good. So please don't be afraid to ask questions or anything like that. So there was a question back there. Your name is? Aisha? What year are you? Okay. Okay. To talk about budgeting? Okay. So what do you want to know about budgeting? Say it again. How to make one. Okay, so there are several ways to think about it. The simplest way to make a budget, and the U.S., I will send you this link later, and I actually have another Google Doc that I can share with you about budgeting that I can give to Nate that you can make public. So the first thing is for budget is they want you to think about, it's the same concept as before, what's the difference between needs and wants, right? So figure out what your needs are. And the basic buckets I've talked to you about are things like housing, food, transportation, and clothing, right? Those are the 4 buckets most personal finance and economists use for most people. And then the next question is what comes out to the wants, right? What do you want to be able to do over the next year or the next 5 years to do that? So then you break that down, right? So then you figure out, when you're thinking about budget, and one of the concepts of budgeting is you have to know the difference between gross income and net income. If you're thinking you're making $100,000 starting out, that's a lot of money to begin with. But if you're making $100,000, and I use 100,000, it's easier to break down, 35% of that will be going to taxes, right? So your gross is going to be 100, but your net is going to be $65,000, right? And so within that $65,000, you got to think about your housing expenses, you got to think about your food expenses, your clothing expenses, and transportation expenses. So that's the first thing, is to figure out what the difference between gross and net is. When I was teaching high school, and I told several people this, this kid comes up, and this is in San Jose, California, and the first kid comes up, and his first job ever, he was working at a pizza delivery. He comes up and he goes, Mr. Marri, what the heck is FICA? Anybody know what FICA is? FICA? Yes? Does that have to do with your credit score? No, that's FICO. Close. FICA? Social Security. Right, so, and every one of us pays Social Security. So that money goes right off the top. So the kid was expecting, at this point, $7 an hour, and he did the math, it was all good, and realized, like, wait, who's FICA and why they're taking my money, right? So Social Security. So so go back to your question. So decide between needs and wants, create those categories, and the next one is to say then you also, one of the next things that most people don't think about is your emergency fund. 60% of Americans, between 50 and 60% of Americans, don't have enough cushion to come up with $500 for emergency expenses. $500, that could be something to do with your car. It could be some unexpected health expense. If you don't have an emergency fund, you're in a lot of trouble. So the next category I would put, besides the needs, is I would put in the unexpected, like the emergency fund, right? They tell you that you want to be able to have an emergency fund to support your lifestyle for 3 to 6 months. That is ridiculous, right? That is a lot of money to be able to put aside to do that. You don't have to start that big. Start small, right? Maybe I can be able to survive for 15 days by myself, and then increase it all the way through. And one way to do that, to do an emergency fund that way, is a tip is that hopefully, all of us get pay raises every time we work at when you're working somewhere. What people do is they take that extra money and they automate it and put it into their emergency fund. Because you are living on it this year, and luckily you can live on the same amount next year because you're lowering your expenses, but that extra money goes towards the emergency funds. So that's one way to do it. So you have your needs, you have your wants, and then you have your emergency. That's one way to do it. And then those of you, most of us are went to Bowdoin, so we didn't have a lot of student loans to graduate, right? That's one thing that is a fixed expense, right? So within that, think about fixed expenses versus non-fixed expenses. Your student loans, if you have them, are fixed expenses. You will be paying that over for the next 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, depending on the term you set up. Housing is a fixed expense. Unless you want to go back and live at home, which is perfectly fine, or you want to stay with a wealthy uncle or aunt, that is perfectly fine. But fixed expenses, Those are things that you have to think about. So if you do fixed expenses versus expenses that are more discretionary to do that. Does that answer your question? Okay. Yes, your name? Ethan. Ethan? Yes. What year are you?
I'm a junior.
You're a junior. Okay, Ethan. Hi.
So is there a literature on how financial literacy actually changes behavior? Like all else equal, like I come to this talk, like what about my consumption and financial decisions is going to change?
Sure. So you're hitting a major point, which is what we don't have is randomized control studies to show how financial literacy across the K through curriculum changes behavior, right? And so part of the reason is the study itself is the problem, is that most people, you don't get to follow up people 5 years down the road. So the University of Arizona, several years back, what they did was they implemented a mandatory financial literacy curriculum for all incoming first years. And then they try to follow them up after the 5 years after graduation. Part of them is low response rate, and so you don't do that. This will not change, my talk today will not change your life, right? I hope it does, but it doesn't. So I call this drive-by professional financial literacy, right? You're just, it's only for an hour, you're gonna talk about this, but that's not gonna change your life. But what we have research to show is that if you do it just in time, personal finance work has exponential returns for behavior. For example, so I'll give you 4 examples. One, I talked to several before earlier this. One is if you engage in personal finance literacy and so forth, when you're about to take a loan, if someone sits down with you and says, you're about to sign up for this loan, this is what it means for 5 years, 10 years, and so forth. Here's the interest rates. Here's what you're taking out. Here's what you are going to end up paying. We know there's a lot of research that changes people's behavior. So that's one example, and just in time. The second time it makes a big difference is when you're about to sign up for a credit card, right? Luckily, as Nate pointed out, Bowdoin doesn't let these credit card companies show up and give you free gifts like t-shirts and mugs and so forth for signing up their credit cards. Some universities are allowed to do that. But if you are about to sign up for a credit card, and that's why the consumer CFPB, the Consumer Finance Protection Board, when they came up with it, what they did was they created a one-pager when you're about to sign up for a credit card that talks about interest rates and so forth. So that's the second example. The third one is when you're about to, when you're doing the budgeting, right? So the question that you asked back there about budgeting, well, you may not remember it, but when you go engage in learning about budgeting, when you're about to create a budget, it makes a huge difference. So those are 3 examples I can tell you about. So it's just in time is one way to do it. Okay. Other questions? Someone had a question back there? Yes, I can't see you.
Hi.
Hi. What's your name?
I'm Abujan, and I'm a first year.
Okay.
Thank you. So we all know that Bowdoin has great financial aid and stuff like that. So let's say you're a student, you don't have a lot of expenses, you don't have to pay for anything. You get some sort of on-campus job which provides a little bit of an income, and then possibly some scholarships that you don't have to pay for, so you can just save. So if you're in that sort of situation, what's the best way to kind of manage that?
The best way to manage that is to set up a Roth IRA. That's without, I've done this personally. I've done this with my first-year cousin who's at Lehigh in Pennsylvania. First thing I said is to set up, if you're earning some income, and you can set up a Roth IRA for as little as $50, right? And you put that money there, and then it goes exponentially. So if I take it you're 17, 18, 19, right? And you have some income that shows that you have an on-campus job. You set up a Roth IRA, you can set up to $5,500 a year in there, up until you make up to $180,000 or something like that as a single payer. You can set that up and go. And the second is to set up an emergency fund. I know you can blame me and my employers, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York and the Federal Reserve System, but we have really low interest rates right now for savings rates and so forth, but that's fine. At least that money, at least you're still getting some, when I started working, the interest rates that you get for savings is about 4, 5, 6%. Now it's all less than 1% to do that, but at least the money is sitting there to do that. Those are the 2 things I would do if I was 17 or 18 and then I had some extra cash. I would put a Roth IRA and then put up a savings account, an emergency fund. Yes?
I'm wondering if you have any advice on where to open Roths, choosing an institution to use for opening.
Okay. So as a Federal Reserve employee, I cannot recommend certain things, but I am a big believer in using firms that give you the lowest expense ratios, right? So that goes back to my first point about lowering your expenses. There are multiple companies out there that do this. I would choose a no-load mutual fund that you can set up in a Roth IRA, and there are hundreds of them. And you pick out what has the lowest expense ratio, and then you look at their returns, how much they're returning over there. But remember, when people, I always look at expenses first, then I look at returns. Some people look at returns. They say, well, if I put $1, I got $1.20 this year, so that's a 20% return. I'm like, and they will tell you it's the stock market, right? The stock market is, it is gambling in legalized form. You're gambling. There's no method to it. You're only doing well because some other person is going to buy your stock later to do that. It's a form of gambling, I would think. And people say, it's a way of investing and so forth. It is not a way of investing. It is just one way of trying to see if you can beat the market, do that. So I would then, regardless, I don't look at the returns because that's, and then to tell you in big, bold, or in italics, past returns are not any indication of future returns. So it's great. So in 2007, I showed you our chart, you are getting 20% on your money. That's great. But from 2008 to 2010, you're getting a negative 20% on your money, right? So you can't say, well, it's done this well in the past. Great. That doesn't guarantee anything. So, but I always look at expense ratios first. And there's tons of firms that you can look at that does it. And some starts with V, some start with F, some start with all these other things. So they're all there. You can look them up. So. Sorry.
Benjamin, I work here.
What's your name?
Benjamin.
Nice to meet you.
So in the same vein, so if you don't get much return on your savings, so would you suggest that we should do a Roth IRA than say trying to invest in the stock market in general then?
So here's what, so I think about it in long, so the savings for an emergency fund is, for me, is a short term, okay? A Roth IRA is something that's gonna be there for 20, 30, 40, 50 years, right? So the stock market since 1920s, 29, after the Great Depression and so forth, has traditionally returned between 6 to 8% annually over every year since then, right? So if you're thinking in the long run, and you say, I don't need this money for another 20, 30 years, I would put it in there. I'm very much invested in the stock market, but I don't look at year-to-year returns. I think about it in 10 years, and what will it be like in 10 years? So I would use a long-term horizon. Okay, yes. Your name?
Tom, I work here too.
Okay.
I've heard with Roths that there's always questions about if they will change the rules at some point to make it so that they will tax it. What's your thought on that?
I don't worry about things I can't control. That's acceptance is a good thing. I accept that I can't control it, and so I do what I know the best decision possible at this moment. You can't worry about the uncertain. Other questions? Yes. Over here and then back over there. Your name is? Calvin. Or Sylvan, okay. If you have the mic, because we're being live streamed, so I encourage you, I know you're loud, I appreciate that, but if we're live streaming it, so yes.
All right, so let's define like a successful investment as, say, beating inflation.
Yes.
Okay, so what's the point in putting money in a savings account if like the 1% the 1% interest doesn't beat inflation? So like why use a savings account when you could put it in, say, like a Roth IRA, an index account, et cetera, with higher rates of return that will guarantee beating inflation rates?
Sure, because I'm a conservative person, because it's cold, hard cash that's there, that's liquid when I can take it when I need it, right? So when you're talking about your question, Benjamin, right? Yep. Right, your question is about thinking about it in the long term, that's fine. but that's tied in for a long term. And for a Roth IRA, you break a Roth IRA and you use it for, besides your first home, there's a tax penalty involved. Whatever you gain plus the 10% withdrawal fee to do that. But I know that if I put in a savings account, I can go anytime and get that cash. And the bank will give it to me.
So as a follow-up, would, like, beyond establishing, let's say, like rainy day money, like, would using a savings account be pointless?
If your point is to have emergency money, it's not pointless.
Well,
right?
I mean, beyond that. Like,
beyond that, that's why I said to you, beyond that, I am very much invested in the equity market and the bond market because of that. I know that it's going to pay off in the long run. As I said to you, since the 1920s, they've returned between 6 and 8% a year. So I'm assuming that it's going to continue.
All right, thanks.
Okay. Question back there. Yes.
So I've read that, I mean, a lot of people do have to take out loans to go to Bowdoin. So like I've read that parents, like it's a good idea to refinance parent loans in the student's name at a lower interest rate, like to build good credit and also just to relieve that burden. Do you think that's a good idea?
I don't make generalized statements, right? But it depends on the context to do that. But you're raising an important question about credit scores. And you know, I asked you about FICA before, and one of you knew what FICO was, which is great. Thank you. So when they always joke that there's no permanent record, there is actually a permanent record, and it starts when you're 18, and it's your credit score, right? Your credit score sticks with you forever, and you can get into the ontological viewpoints of whether they should, some companies that you have no control over tell it to determine. You can do all that, but it exists, right? And it will determine what the cost of money is for you, right? So if you have a high credit score, you're going to get the best interest rates on credit cards, mortgages, anything that you borrow. And people will come out and give you money. They will say, well, you can get a personal loan because you have a high credit score. So for you, I do recommend that you build up your credit. And one way to do that is to pay your credit card bills on time. That's the biggest factor to do that. So your credit score does matter. In terms of your first part of the question, I would not answer that question because borrowing, that's a family decision to do that. But if you're interested in doing your credit, you can get a secured credit card that for $250 or $50, $500 basically says you have a $500 credit limit and you promise to pay it off. That establishes a credit history, and then that you can make that more stellar as you go along. And credit scores go anywhere from about 400 all the way to like 820, 850, depending on which agency you use. So I would do that. And in the news, we've been paying attention to Equifax and all these other things about credit scores and so forth and FICO. All our credit history is out there. Just live with it. There's no way around it. I mean, we have 10 million people's credit scores and so forth out there. That's how it is. But I encourage you to think about your credit score. Other questions? Yes.
Hi, I'm Allie.
Hi, Allie.
I'm a sophomore. Along the same lines, I don't have a credit card. I have a debit card, and I'm thinking like, what is should I get a credit card or do other things to actually build a credit score? Because I guess I probably don't really have a credit score. I don't have any loans. Should I try to build good credit, and if so, how would I do that?
So it goes back to your personal philosophy. My personal philosophy is that you're probably going to need to borrow money sometime for a home or anything like that. So I encourage you to get a credit card that's manageable, that pays on time. And I'm a big believer in credit unions. They give you the best rates possible. They're also member-owned and so forth, and they're nonprofits. So if a credit card I still have my Stanford credit union account and my Wisconsin credit union account. And so I encourage all of you to try to build some type of credit, but at the same time be responsible for it, right? If you spend $500, you don't want that to cost you $1,000 in interest to do that. So I am a big believer in starting small, 1 or 2. I only have 2 credit cards that I use, and so that way you can build up credit based on those 2, and they're manageable. Life is complicated enough already, and so you don't want to deal with more factors to do that. But that's my view. Other questions? Yes, back there. Do you have a question too? Okay. Yes.
What's the difference between a Roth IRA, 401k, and a 403b?
So they're all investment vehicles for retirement. So IRA is it's called an individual retirement account that you as an owner can set up on your own, and you can contribute up to, I believe, $5,500 or $6,500, and if you're over 50, it's a different rate to do that. So that's something that you can do. Usually the 401k and a 403b are offered through your employers. 403bs are offered through nonprofits, and 401ks are usually for-profit companies. And what it does is that it takes a certain amount of money out of your paycheck, and then you put it in. And for a Roth, it's post-tax. After all the taxes are there, from your net income, they put it in there. And what happens is it's mostly offered through employers. The employers match a certain part of that. As I said to you, like the Federal Reserve Bank gives me 7% of what I put in as a match to do that. So those 2 are usually set up through an employer. You could set up a Roth individualized, self-employed plans, and there's a bunch of variety of sources you can do that with, but that's the big difference. And there's also non-Roth IRAs. There's a traditional IRA, which is the same thing. What it is, a traditional IRA is the year you contribute to, it's tax deductible, means that you get to deduct from your taxes, but the other part of that equation is that you have to pay taxes when you get it out, right? Right. The federal government, the state government, and the local government, and the county governments are big believers in taxes, right? Because taxes are services, so that's to be fair about that. And so they will figure out how to get your income and your taxes regardless. So either you pay for it now through a Roth IRA and a Roth 401k and 403, or you pay for it later. Okay? Yes, Ben, Jamin. Sorry.
This is another question. It's a little larger.
Go ahead.
It's somewhat political too. So the idea you're talking about, getting rid of Social Security, right? Social Security is not working. This is the narrative. But all the money you put
That's a minority view. That's a minority.
No,
view.
I'm talking about that's some of the narrative in our society. I'm not saying that.
Sure.
So the idea that all the money we put in, because I'm almost 40 years old, so I've been putting in to FICA for the last 20 years. What really happened to that money in general, or your thoughts on that, or how can you really? Will we lose it all if things change in that regards?
So I'm going to go back to my earlier point, is I don't worry about things I can't control. And one of the things is Social Security has the backing of all the retirees in this country, right? And all the people that have been putting it there. And that is that the retirees are a very powerful political force in this country. And people that are coming to retirement are a force in this country. So I would be it would be very hard for me to believe that someone would get rid of Social Security or change it in a way that you are, in a way that's very substantial. This happened in the previous the younger George Bush presidency, and it was not touched. And so it's very hard to touch Social Security, I believe. Same way it is hard to touch Medicare and Medicaid. So those are my opinions based on my reading of economic policy. So that's my take on that. And then Social Security, you don't necessarily get what you put into it, right? It is for something that is, there's a tax, there's a max, right? There's a Social Security cap where if you're making up to a certain amount, they take it out, but after a certain amount, they don't take out Social Security. So there's a difference. So it's not a 1-to-1 ratio. And remember, Social Security it's a social safety net for the whole country. It's just not you. So it's the whole idea of the common good. And so that's what we have to keep in mind. We do not live in a libertarian society where everyone is for themselves, but we live in a democratic republic where we are trying to make sure that we have social services for people that cannot help themselves. Other questions? We're good, right? It's 1:30. I won't get into the Federal Reserve because it's already 1:30. Thank you very much for asking your questions. I hope it was useful for you. I hope it changes your life, but I won't be disappointed if it doesn't change your life. And also, Nate knows how to get in touch with me. You can look me up. There's only one Marri in the Federal Reserve System across the country. And there's only one Marri at Columbia. I have both email addresses and both appointments, and I'd be happy to talk. And I'm a big believer. You guys are in a great school. Enjoy your ride, but be financially smart as well. So thank you again.